Okay, girls, I'm just going to go very, very quickly through the War of Independence for you there. So what you need to know here is what happened in the first Dáil and what were the main events of the War of Independence. And also I'll put up on the Google Classroom some questions that have come up from the exam papers on this topic. So you can look over the questions once you've looked at this PowerPoint and just, see where would you be able to answer them. Okay, so remember, girls, after the 1916 Rising, before the Rising, there wasn't much support in Ireland in general for this Republican struggle. There wasn't much support for rebellion and violence. People didn't want their lives to be turned upside down with fighting because the First World War was going on. It was an uncertain time. And when the 1916 Rising happened, there wasn't really much support from the Irish people for the rebels. But you have to remember then the way that some of the leaders of the Rising were treated by the British afterwards. They were executed, brutally executed, thrown into jail. That really turned people's support, and now there was a strong support for the Rising. And Sinn Féin came out very well after the Rising, that everyone assumed that Sinn Féin were involved in the Rising, but that wasn't actually the case. But they had a surge in popularity as a result. Okay, so you can see there that they didn't take part in the Rising, but their popularity grew rapidly afterwards. In the general election of 1918, Sinn Féin won a massive 70% of the parliamentary seats. So in the first election after the Rising, Sinn Féin swept the board. So before that, it was the Home Rule Party led by Redmond that was the strongest party in Ireland. And now it's Sinn Féin. And Sinn Féin had a very strong Republican manifesto. They really wanted Ireland to have full independence for Britain and to become a republic. So if you look here in the elections, you can see before the 1918 election, Sinn Féin only had 7 seats. So very, very small party with very little power. After the election, then they got 73 seats, and you can see that there's a reversal there between Sinn Féin and the Home Rule Party. So Sinn Féin was by far the strongest party after that election. Now, the MPs, Sinn Féin MPs, because obviously, girls, since the Act of Union in 1800, there's no longer a parliament in Dublin. So any Irish MPs who were elected have to sit in London, which Sinn Féin refused to do. And to this day, any Sinn Féin elected in Northern Ireland, they're entitled to sit in the Parliament in London, but they refuse to do so. So they set up their own Parliament in Dublin. Okay. They also announced that violence might be used to win Irish independence. So they are not, they're saying that they would use violence where necessary. And the British government obviously were concerned about this, and they banned Sinn Féin and the Dáil. Okay, so this kind of set the stage then for war, and it set the stage obviously because they had been banned. That made them very angry, and so the Civil War was about to begin. So on the 21st of January 1919, the first Dáil met at the Mansion House in Dublin, and it declared Ireland a republic. Okay, it promised a democratic program of social reform. So it said that it was going to change Ireland for the better, increasing health and education and jobs and all of this. Out of those elected, only 27 TDs were present because many were still in jail as a result of the Rising. So it was kind of a small but important affair. At the Dáil's second meeting on the 1st of April, Eamon de Valera became president, and you can see there some of the ministers that he appointed. So Michael Collins there was the Minister for Finance, Madam Markievicz, Minister for Labour. So very unusual that you have a woman in politics at this time. Not just for Ireland, but for anywhere in the world. It was unusual to have women high up in politics. Okay, there's a picture of some of the first MPs at the first sitting. Okay. Now, after this, then, de Valera went to America to try and raise some funds and to persuade the American government to recognise the Irish Republic. So remember, girls, they had basically just declared themselves a republic, but didn't really have nothing legal to back it up. He failed in that the Americans refused to acknowledge Ireland as a republic, but he did raise a lot of money from the Irish Americans. While he was away, Griffith took over. Okay. So they set up then an alternative Dáil. So this Dáil in Dublin, which was not allowed really under law because of the Act of Union, they were going to run Ireland as the way that they saw fit. Okay, so De Valera had secured a lot of money then to bring back then for some of the things that they wanted to implement. So you can see Collins organised a loan of 350,000, okay, to pay for weapons and the cost of running the government. Courts were set up to replace British courts. Many local councils switched their support to the Dáil. So around the country then, different councils were starting to report to the Dáil in Dublin rather than to the British government. Now, War of Independence, it began 21st of January 1919 in Solohead Beg in Tipperary. Okay, 2 constables from the RIC were killed by a group of volunteers, but the Dáil hadn't approved this attack. So this fella, Dan Breen, went out and killed RIC. Remember, the RIC is the Royal Irish Constabulary. It was a police force for Ireland set up by the British. But many of the people who worked in the RIC, many of the policemen, were actually Irish people, but they were just getting their wages paid from Britain. But there was a resentment there. People hated the RIC because it was seen as a symbol of Britishness. Now, so Dan Breen then went and he attacked some RIC and killed them. The volunteers were renamed the Irish Republican Army. So now fighting broke out between the IRA and the RIC. Much of it in the countryside. Now, Michael Collins then, he was the Director of Intelligence at the IRA, and he had a network of spies throughout the country. So he had people spying on the British, spying on the RIC. He even had spies in Dublin Castle. Okay, so he had people who were officially working for the British government, working for the British administration, but on the side they were spying and they were bringing back information to the IRA. He set up a group of assassins called the Squad, and they murdered anyone who was a British spy. If you get the chance, girls, over the Easter holidays, you might want to watch the film Michael Collins. You could be able to see some of this in action. It's a good portrayal. Okay, so the tactics used then by the RA, they used guerrilla warfare. So this is where they would basically hide in the bushes and jump out and attack whenever they saw RIC passing. And then they would disappear back again. And remember, the IRA they weren't a proper army. They didn't wear a uniform. They just dressed in normal everyday clothes. So they were very easily able to blend back into the background. And people would hide them. So people would hide them in their sheds or hide them in their houses, or they would just hide themselves in a hedge or under a bush or in a farm building. So it was very hard to catch them. Okay. So the British found it very difficult to find them. So they were very successful in this type of warfare. Now, the IRA then formed the Flying Columns. So these were full-time volunteers. And remember, girls, the IRA as well, they were volunteer soldiers or fighters. You know, they had a day job as well. They were just kind of doing it on the side. They weren't properly trained. They didn't have any military training. But these Flying Columns, these were full-time volunteers. So they spent their time going around and training other groups around the country on guerrilla tactics, on how best to achieve what they wanted to. In response then, the British sent over the Black and Tans. So the Black and Tans were ex-British soldiers to help the RIC, because the RIC were losing against the IRA. So they came over, and later a second group called auxiliaries were recruited. Okay, so the first group were ex-British soldiers, the Black and Tans. And then they needed more support, so they got ex-army officers. So these are people more high up in the army with more experience, called the auxiliaries. So now on the British side, you have the RIC, you have the Black and Tans, and you have the auxiliaries, all fighting together against the IRA. Okay, now these English groups were quite ruthless and brutal, and they didn't see anything wrong with attacking women and children, and so obviously the Irish people were very much against them, and they supported the IRA. Okay, so there's some pictures of the Black and Tans. This one down here is from a film, but the other two are primary sources. There's the auxiliaries there. Now, revenge attacks. Sometimes when a policeman was killed, the British forces hit back by terrorising the local people. Houses were burnt down, towns smashed up, and prisoners were shot. So quite brutal. The British forces were very brutal, and then this turned the support very much away from the British and towards the IRA. In December 1920, the Black and Tans burned Cork City. Okay. There's the Kilmichael ambush. So lots of ambushes happening out in the countryside. Now, Bloody Sunday, this is November 1920. This is where Collins' squad assassinated 11 British spies in Dublin. And then as a reprisal, the Black and Tans came into Croke Park on the day of a football match, and they started firing, and they killed 12 Irish people, including Hogan, who was the Tipperary goalkeeper, and 60 others were injured. And that was called Bloody Sunday. So remember, that was in reprisal. So Michael Collins had ordered a killing first, and then later on that day, the British counterattacked in reprisal. Okay. Now, this went on for a number of months. People in Britain were embarrassed by the brutality of the forces in Ireland, and pressure was put on the government to end the war. And also on the Irish side, the IRA were running out of weapons, so they couldn't continue this for much longer. So a truce was agreed on the 11th of July 1921. Okay. After the truce, then there was a delegation sent over to England to agree the Anglo-Irish Treaty. So there's the newspaper on the day that the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed. So the treaty negotiations were held in London. You had Arthur Griffiths and Michael Collins. They led the delegation, so they led the group to discuss the treaty. Sinn Féin wanted to achieve certain things when they went over there. They wanted a republic, so complete independence, and they wanted the island of Ireland to be one, no partition between North and South. So when they went in to negotiate the treaty, that's what they were looking for. The British, on the other hand, then, they wanted to keep Ireland as part of the empire. So they had two opposite aims. And when he had signed the treaty, so after a couple of months of negotiations, the treaty was eventually signed, and Michael Collins said that he had signed his own death warrant. So they didn't achieve all the things that they wanted to achieve in the treaty, and Collins knew that, and he knew that it wasn't going to be accepted when he returned. Okay, so this is the terms of the treaty. Ireland was to be called the Irish Free State. So it wasn't a republic, it was called a Free State. It would remain a dominion, which means it was part of the Commonwealth. So countries like Canada, Australia, they were also part of the British Commonwealth. They're part of the empire. They're not completely independent. A Governor General would represent the King in Ireland. Members of the Irish Parliament would have to take an oath to the Irish government and to the King. So this was the one that really kind of, they didn't like having to swear an oath of loyalty to the King. So they're still having to do that. Britain would have the use of 3 ports. Okay, so they could, if time of war or if they needed to use Irish ports, they could use those 3 ports. And a boundary commission would be set up to decide the border between the North and the South. So girls, that was a very quick run through there of the treaty and the War of Independence. So have a look at that. I'm going to put up some questions there, and just, you can look at the questions and see would you be able to answer them. Okay.